Hello and welcome back to another update where we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We have two territorial changes in the Avdiivka and Robotyne directions, as well as a new report based on soldiers fighting in the war in Ukraine, talking about the current situation within the Ukrainian army, as well as what is likely to happen and the current situation about them over the next few weeks and months. We start out in the direction of Robotyne, where some geolocated footage has shown that the Russians shelled a Ukrainian position here in the first line of Ukrainian soldiers trying to advance and Russian FPV drones hitting their positions. This area was previously a gray zone, as there is a short distance between the Ukrainian lines and the Russian trenches here in the area. As such, we see now that there is some movement by the Ukrainians trying to launch some sort of operation and checking the Russian defenses in the area, as well as checking out if there's any changes and developments. So generally a probing attack, and yes, this is an actual probing attack, unlike what we saw in the summer offensive. And as such, we see that there is this small Ukrainian advance here in the northwest of Robotyne, as they attempt to pressure the Russians here by the west of Robotyne. Since they started attacking from the eastern direction, they had failed to gain full control over the trenches, so now they're expanding the front a bit. We then move on to the Avdiivka direction, where here we see that the Ukrainians launched a series of counterattacks, of which one of those includes this video here of a Ukrainian tank counterattacking Russian positions here to the north of the Russian advances. So in this footage, we see multiple Ukrainian tanks, actually two, as they drive into the roads here to the north of the residential area here to the southwest of Avdiivka. We see in the background the high-rise buildings, and then they drive into these roads as they try to pressure and launch this counterattack against the Russian positions. However, this is not a counterattack where Ukrainian soldiers recapture territory, but instead this is a probing attack where the Ukrainians try and find out what exactly are the Russian positions so that they can detect some for artillery usage, but also sort of seeing what kind of resistance, what kind of presence the Russians have in the area. If the Ukrainians were looking to recapture territory, they would need infantry as well to take a foothold inside of these buildings. Could also be that the Ukrainians already had some infantry inside of these buildings, and these tanks drove in to cover further advances. As such, we've seen that there's a lot of fighting taking place here in the northern parts of the Avdiivka residential area as Russians continue to consolidate their gains further south. And with this, we see that if the Russians want to hold on to this area and advance further, they need to clear up the areas behind so that they can send more and more troops here to the front so that they can continue their advances. We see that the Ukrainians definitely are not weak in the Avdiivka area. They still have tanks to spare, they still have infantry to spare, and as such, we see that the Russian foothold here and further advancements are likely to be very slow, as the Ukrainians have a lot of forces to stand behind. And this also shows the significance of the pipe that the Russians found, as without that pipe, the Russians would have a very difficult time advancing as much as they have, as we see that the Ukrainians simply launch a counterattack as soon as they found out the situation. And since then, they're launching these raids, trying to drive in, hit Russian positions, and then drive out again to avoid getting hit themselves. So we're seeing that there is this constant back and forth between the Russians and the Ukrainians, where the Ukrainians are trying to regain some of these positions, and the Russians are simply fighting to hold on to them for as long as possible while the back line is being cleared. And based on this footage where the Ukrainian tanks, in a very quick sense, just went in and then left again, but they weren't faced off against any anti-tank weaponry. This is likely due to the nature of the Russian advancements here, mainly consisting of the ones going through the pipe, and going through that pipe makes it difficult to transport larger weaponry, and also speaks to the importance of the Russians getting their own armored vehicles and tanks here to the front to allow further advancements. They cannot advance non-stop without armored vehicles, as the Ukrainians are using their own in the area. However, that is also very vulnerable, as they have to go through large open fields to actually reach the front, and even if they do reach it, the Ukrainians already have established positions, so it could be very costly. They can simply use the infantry to advance, similar to how the Wagner forces were mainly using only infantry in the Bakhmut direction. But then again, they would need to transport heavier weaponry to the front then, such as ATGMs and so on, allowing them to deal with the Ukrainian armored vehicles. But most importantly is the need of further air support and artillery support for these forces if they want successful advancements. And as such, we see that there's heavy fighting, and it will likely continue with this infantry-based assaults by the Russians and some Ukrainian armored vehicles trying to hold them back and take advantage of the Russian weaknesses in the area, considering they haven't completely consolidated their gains here in the section of the front line. We then move on to what I mentioned earlier about the general situation, and we have this report by, if you have watched Willie, he is a Australian veteran who has interviewed plenty of Ukrainian soldiers and a single Russian soldier through this war. He's also done other reporting on conflicts, including the Israeli-Palestinian war. And one of his contacts in Ukraine, he's a foreign fighter fighting for Ukraine, and he has a different outlook over the situation compared to the average soldier, as he has a higher officer's position. But based on his report, he talks about the general situation and how difficult it is for the Ukrainians right now. He talks about how the mobilization bill of the Ukrainians failed to pass, and even if it did pass, it would be terrible because it's very tough, it's very strict, making it bad for the Ukrainian morale. And on the contrary, the Russians are growing significantly every day, and this growth is allowing for additional offensive operations by the Russians. Russian forces continue to build up forces for a future offensive, particularly in the north near Kupiansk and Kharkiv axis. The Institute for the Study of War has stated that an offensive on this axis poses a low risk. We, as in him and his colleagues, believe to the contrary that the Ukrainians' northern flanks are in extreme danger as Ukrainian supply lines remain overextended, and as Russian operational reserves grow, we assess this sector to be a moderate to severe risk. So based on this information, we can assume that the Ukrainians are expecting some sort of Russian offensive operations here in the north by Kharkiv and Kupiansk. As Russians continuously build up their forces, this has also been confirmed by my sources in the Russian army, that there is a constant buildup of Russian soldiers in the north, not just in the Kupiansk-Kreminna area, but also here in the Belgrade direction. So there is an increase of Russian personnel in that area. And to talk about this increase in personnel in the Russian army, although there hasn't been a significant increase in the amount of soldiers at the front line over the past few months, there has been a significant change, and that is the Russian soldiers are now much more able to go on vacation, to take rotations. At the start, the Russian soldiers would go on for a year or two without a single rotation. Now they are going on rotation every 3 to 6 months. And this includes all of them, the most experienced and the least experienced. This means that the Russians simply have so many soldiers right now that they can constantly go on rotation as needed. And this shows that the Russians now have a significant room to maneuver with this increase in forces. Back to what he says, additionally, Russian forces in Belarus are finally starting to materialize into a serious threat. We assess the possibility of a raid into Ukrainian territory as moderate. However, operational action is still low. As such, he says that there's likely going to be some sort of smaller raids across the border in Belarus. They assess that there is a moderate risk for it based on the buildup, as such something like deep reconnaissance groups or others going into Ukrainian territory to mess with the supply lines or simply stage some sort of small-scale operation, but nothing significant. He then moves on to talk about the recent frontline developments like the capture of Vesele by the Russians and in the direction of the village of Kohmelne. That these advancements took place due to the low morale, lack of effective equipment, and poorly constructed defensive works, many of which have not improved since last year. He's talking about how the morale of the Ukrainians have significantly decreased since the failure of their offensive and the subsequent Russian buildup of troops, showing that although they have been fighting for now almost 2 years, The Russian army has simply just grown bigger and stronger. Although the Ukrainian army is also bigger and stronger than at the start of the war, this Russian change and the fact that, again, the Ukrainians are struggling to mobilize further troops while the Russians are increasing day by day is having an effect on the soldiers at the front line. And at the same time, the Ukrainians are so hard-pressed through the front that they simply do not have enough available forces to simply build up their fortifications, especially at the front line. Since it's been so stable, this also means that building or fortifying further the fortifications you already have is very risky because they are at frontline positions. The back line has definitely become stronger, especially in the Donetsk region, where we've seen footage of the Ukrainians building a similar sort of defensive style operation as the Russians did in the Zaporizhia front, where they're adding dragon teeth. They're likely also going to build anti-tank ditches. But based on that, we see that the Ukrainians are building up their fortifications, and not to take the bad morale as an exaggeration, it's definitely worse than it was before, but I wouldn't say that it is bad. Based on what I've talked with Ukrainian soldiers, they definitely feel motivated to continue fighting, and they definitely believe that they will continue to do so. But something that is very heavy on the mind of the Ukrainian soldier is the lack of Western support. He also says that something that has a significant effect on what is happening at the front line is the lack of not just manpower, but also artillery shells and other munitions. This allows the Russians to have a significant firepower advantage, and that is definitely felt on the front line. Finally, according to an assessment of a Russian soldier, the Ukrainians are completely switching up the organization of their army back to these small independent brigades compared to divisions or army corps or groups. This is something that happened prior to the Ukrainian summer offensive. They believed that the best way to operate would be in these smaller groups. And as such, we have seen that the whole operation has switched to that, where small brigades function independently as a separate organization itself. This allows the Ukrainians to rapidly redeploy from different parts of the front. And this is definitely a strength when it comes to the lack of manpower they have. If they have a lot of less trained soldiers and a lot of professional soldiers, then these professional soldiers can move according to where the different areas are the hardest. For example, in Avdiivka, we're likely going to see a lot of elite Ukrainian soldiers fighting there to hold back the Russian advancements. On the other side, on the contrary, the Russians have switched completely up to this division/army corps operational standard, where they are, instead of launching these smaller independent brigades, which they still have, but on a much smaller scale, they now have the majority in these larger divisions and army corps. And based on that, we see that if the Russians continue on this track and learn how to develop the different areas well, so that they are able to launch larger coordinated attacks, we may see, as the Ukrainians fear, a Russian attack on Kharkiv, for example, or a new front opening, or whatever it may be. The point being a large-scale attack if they can coordinate large groupings. And that is definitely what they're training. Since the Ukrainian summer offensive, they have switched to this organization. It finished here in late 2023. So now in 2024, everything is ready, but they're still lacking experience in this sense that they need to gain more experience, especially on the offensive scale, to be able to launch a proper offensive operation. This is something that the Belarusian army is fearing, is that their own lack of combat experience could undermine a future offensive from the north. And this is likely why we are lacking any sort of operation by the Belarusians, as they are likely just staying on the defensive, building defensive structures, and preparing for defensive operations rather than anything offensive in nature, as they do not have any combat experience. But the Russians, having this combat experience, would have a much easier time adapting to the offensive compared to the defensive. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.